the ESG scores running against you that no one is tracking. Most sustainability teams spend the better part of the year producing the annual report. They know what went into it. They know the methodology. They can defend every number. What many of those same teams can't tell you is how their company is currently being scored by the organizations their investors, insurers, and buyers are actually consulting, and where the gap between the internal report and the external score has quietly opened up. That gap is no longer an optics problem, it's a risk position. The scoring infrastructure, most companies aren't mapping. Over the past several years, a parallel accountability infrastructure has taken shape around corporate sustainability. It includes NGO watchdogs, third-party rating agencies, proxy advisors, and buyer-driven disclosure programs. Each of these operates on its own methodology. None of them are obligated to use your sustainability report as their primary source. The organizations that feed into investor, insurer, and buyer decisions include CDP, MSCI, S&P Global, Sustainalytics, and sector-specific watchdog groups. Their outputs now touch how your securities are categorized for investor mandates, whether your green bonds price favorably, whether major buyers qualify you for preferred supplier status, and increasingly how your insurance underwriters model your risk profile. Internal audits at a number of organizations have surfaced a consistent pattern. Sustainability teams that haven't mapped how their company appears across major third-party scoring platforms are often surprised, when someone finally runs the analysis, by how much variability exists between the self-assessment and the external perception. The company believes it's performing well. The score says otherwise, and nobody internal was watching the score. More than 270 major buyers requested environmental data from roughly 45,000 suppliers through CDP's supply chain program in 2025 alone. For companies on the supplier end of those relationships, a poor or absent CDP profile isn't an advocacy problem. It's contract risk. The methodology problem is getting worse. What makes this harder to manage is that the scoring methodologies themselves are moving, often quietly, mid-cycle, and in ways that don't make the weekly sustainability briefing. MSCI updated its ESG ratings methodology to place greater emphasis on industry-specific key issue weighting. A company that was performing well on a broad environmental metric may find itself exposed on a sector-specific issue it never prioritized, with no change to actual operations. S&P Global revised its ESG scores to give increased weight to controversy assessments, which means how your company appears in third-party media, regulatory databases, and NGO reporting now carries more scoring weight than before. One enforcement action, one sustained NGO flag, one credible critical report can move a score in ways that even strong internal performance data won't quickly offset. Morningstar Sustainalytics has continued tightening its model, giving progressively less weight to self-reported figures where independent verification is absent. The result is a situation that confuses and frustrates most sustainability teams. A score drops, performance didn't change, and the explanation, buried in a methodology update document nobody was tracking, is that the rules changed. Companies that treat this as a communications problem to manage will keep losing ground. Companies that treat it as a governance problem to solve will close the gap, where public reporting cycles expose the data gaps. Earth Day creates a natural pressure point that makes the underlying problem more visible. Annual public reporting tied to this cycle tends to surface internal data inconsistencies because it forces companies to assemble a coherent public narrative from data systems that weren't built to talk to each other. The gaps that show up most often are predictable. Climate adaptation and resilience planning is one. S&P Global's 2024 Corporate Sustainability Assessment found that only 35% of assessed companies disclosed context-specific adaptation and resilience plans, up from roughly 20 to 30% in prior years, but with significant sectoral variation, with utilities 58% and real estate 50% leading, while finance and health lag. Companies that haven't built this into their public disclosure are being assessed on absence, not on what they're actually doing internally. Disclosure volume is another. Over 22,100 companies disclosed environmental information through CDP in 2025, and among those scored, 4%, 877 companies, achieved CDP's A-list rating. the threshold that signals genuinely comprehensive, verified environmental data. The gap between showing up and scoring well is where most companies are losing credibility without realizing it. Only a third of investors surveyed believe the ESG reports they read are good quality. Less than 40% trust the ESG ratings and scores they receive. Those numbers are uncomfortable for rating agencies. They're more uncomfortable for sustainability teams that have spent months producing reports the market isn't trusting. The governance shift that changes the equation. The proxy advisor landscape is also quietly reorganizing in ways sustainability teams need to understand. Glass Lewis announced it will no longer publish a single set of benchmark voting policies starting in 2027, moving to customized voting policies on a client-by-client basis. ISS stepped back from blanket ESG voting policies in early 2026. The standardized floorboards have used to manage ESG governance expectations is being replaced by investor-specific standards, which means a company that was meeting the benchmark may now be out of alignment with its specific major investors without knowing it. For sustainability leaders, this isn't an investor relations problem to be handed off. It requires knowing, specifically, what the major investors in your capital structure are actually expecting, and whether your current disclosure program answers those questions or routes around them. What the practical response looks like. None of this requires a full program overhaul. The companies managing this well have done something more targeted. They've built visibility into how they're being scored externally, not just how they're performing internally. That means mapping the scoring platforms most relevant to your sector and investor base. Understanding the current methodology behind each, not last year's, the current one. Identifying where gaps between internal data and external scores exist, and prioritizing the gaps that are feeding into investor or buyer decisions over the ones that are primarily reputational. CDP engagement in particular is worth treating as a core disclosure function rather than an annual checkbox exercise. The companies with consistent, improving CDP profiles aren't doing it because they love filling out questionnaires. They're doing it because the output feeds into institutional investor decisions, supply chain qualification, and insurance underwriting in concrete ways. The annual sustainability report is still important, but it's one input into an external accountability ecosystem that is operating independently of it, and increasingly, it's not the input that matters most. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.